put a title on this message, I would call it The Costly Casualty of Coasting. There's a costly casualty when you decide you're going to coast. When I was thinking about that coasting, I remembered whenever I first learned to drive. I first learned to drive, my parents had their family car. That's all we got to drive was the family car if we get to take it out. Our family car was a 1968 Dodge Monaco. Any of you remember that? Some of you looking like said, man, you mean they made cars back then? Yes, they did. In 1968, they made Dodge Monacos. That thing was like a tank. It was huge. Let me tell you about that. It had all the nice things, power steering, power brakes, it had all the stuff. But they had not quite perfected all of those things. Because here's what happened with a Dodge Monaco. If the motor went dead, everything quit. I mean, there was no way to turn it because the power steering just would lock up. Man, you just have to wrestle it. The power brakes would quit. I mean, as long as the motor was on, things were fine. But when the motor went down, you were in trouble. And when I thought about the costly casualties of coasting, I remember driving that Dodge Monaco. Because there was one thing about that Dodge Monaco, it liked going dead. I mean, it was one of those cars you had to keep gas on it all the time. It was slow to warm up. Man, you never could get the thing warm. And it never failed that you could be going down a hill and that thing would go dead. And then you're wrestling with it, and you don't know how to drive anyway. You're trying to stay out of the ditches, the main goal you have at that particular time. And you're wrestling with that Dodge Monaco trying to push on brakes that don't work. And in your mind, you're thinking, I am going to die. Right here, my driving experience is dying in a 1968 Dodge Monaco, and on my tombstone, he coasted to death. It was scary, but let me tell you something. There's something more frightful and fearful than that, whether you realize it or not, and that is when you begin to coast spiritually. And we all will have that temptation to do that. We'll all have that temptation when things have been going good and we've been on the blessing side and things are wonderful and, man, we've been pursuing all those good things of God and God's been blessed. We're going to get up there and we're going to say, you know what, I think I'm just going to take it easy a while. I think I'm not going to teach that class this year. I don't think I'm going to be in that Bible study this year. I don't think I'm going to go to the prayer room anymore. I don't think I'm going to go witness anymore. I think we'll take some weekends and go on vacation instead of being at church. I tell you what, I just think we've done a lot of good spiritual things. We got it built up on this side, all the good things. We could afford not to have quite as many good things in our life. And we're just going to slow down and we are going to coast. We're just going to coast. Now, we're not going to do any bad things. We're just going to coast a little while spiritually. Mark it down. There's costly casualty when you decide to coast. There is no coasting. At least there's no safe coasting in the spiritual life. And David comes to a place where he decides he's going to coast. Listen what it says in 2 Samuel chapter 11. First three words. Then it happened. You need to circle that. Then it happened. Then what happened? Something that David, if he were standing here today, wished God hadn't recorded. Something if David would standing here today, he wished would have never happened. Something if David could come and say, if there's one thing in my life that I want to correct, it's that thing in my life. Then it happened. What happened? Here's what happened. Notice. In the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab, his servants, with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. Underline this. But David stayed at Jerusalem. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing in the Bible story and in that time historically. It says, then it happened in the spring of the year when it's time for the kings to go do battle. It sounds like football season, doesn't it? All right, football season rolling around. It's time to watch Bama and Tigers play. And we're going to go watch. In the spring of the year when the kings go out to do battle. All right, it's battling season. It really was. In the winter, they were basically taking care of their home front and doing those things. And in order for the kings to maintain their territory and the servitude of those and to keep people in line, they would have to go out and do battle in the spring of the year. They would have to go out if somebody tried to do an uprising, somebody tried to rebel, somebody wasn't going to pay what they're supposed to pay. The kings had to go out and do battle to keep things in order. And therefore, everybody knew that in the spring of the year, the kings went out to do battle. Here's the question. Who was the king of Israel? Who was the king of Israel? The rest of you don't know? Let me tell you. Hold on a second. Psh, listen. We're studying about David. Do y'all have that? We're studying the life of David. Do y'all have it now? Okay, let's back up again. Who was the king of Israel? Wow, you are a bright, but who told y'all that? Somebody let y'all know that, didn't it? David was the king of Israel. And therefore, if it's the spring of the year and the time when the kings go out to do battle, who should have been at the lead of the nation of Israel going out to do battle? Whose responsibility was it to go out and to lead his nation in battle? Whose responsibility? That's right, David. But then it happened that at the time when King David had the responsibility to go out and to lead his nation and to do battle, he sent somebody else. He sent, a good man, Joab, who's a great general, great warrior, great leader. He sent somebody good in his place, and he sent his servants with him, and he sent all the people of Israel out there to do battle. And the battle was fine because Joab went out and led his nation towards battle, and they defeated Ammon at Rabbah. No problem with the nation of Israel. No problem with the fact that they're continuing their victories. No problem with those things. But wait a minute. But instead of David being the one who gets the credit for the victory, instead of David being the one who's doing what he's supposed to be doing, instead of David leading like he as a king should be doing, David does not go, but rather it says he stays at home. He stays at home. He stays in Jerusalem, sending somebody else to do his job, somebody else to fulfill his responsibility, somebody else to go about the task of working, somebody to stay on in regard to the purpose and plan of that nation. He sends somebody else, but he decides he's going to coast. Go back up to those three words. Then it happened. Then it happened what? That he decided to coast. Now, in case you might miss it, I want to make sure that you understand there is a tremendous application here. And that is that you and I have the same temptation in our lives to coast. Spiritually, we have a temptation to just take it easy. I'm going to let somebody else. One of the crises of our church right now is that we're in a coasting mode. We are. Let me just tell you where we are in a coasting mode. We're in a coasting mode because right now we're about to start a new church here. We got children's workers we don't have. We got preschool workers we don't have. We got adult classes that don't have teachers. Do you know that? Only about 500 people that gather here every Sunday, and we can't find people to take care of 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and teach Sunday school classes for children, and can't find adult teachers to lead. Somebody, somewhere, is coasting. And there's a danger whenever you begin to coast. Oh, well, Brother Mack, you just don't know my story. If you knew what I'd been through, if you'd known what all those things that are happening, well, I guess God knows your story, and he left you here. Amen? Some of us tell such stories. God just ought to take us on to glory and give us rest right then. How would you feel that way if your story became so sad, God just take you on to glory? Your story would change, wouldn't it? Most of you say, I want to go to heaven, but not right now. I want to go to heaven, but not right now. But to hear our stories, we act as though we're ready to go. We're not in a place of coasting. We have things to do. But we don't just coast as a church. We coast individually. Now, I don't go to your house and I don't live with you, but let me ask you, has there been a time whenever you had a quiet time and you got up and you spent time with God and you read the Word and you prayed and you journaled and you prayed for other people, intercede, saw God answer prayer? And then if I were to talk to you about it right now and you'd be totally honest, you don't still have that quiet time. You sleep a little longer. Things are too busy. Things are too hectic around things. You got too much to do and you don't spend time with God. You don't read time with His Word. Could that happen in your life? Oh, Brother Mack, why are you talking like that? Because I'm wanting you to understand there is a danger when you begin to coast. Well, that wouldn't happen to me. Circle those words. Then it happened. I hope you're getting that. If you get anything outside this message, I hope you get those three words. Then it happened. Now let me tell you, I know that you are a great person, probably one of the best. But let me tell you something. Let me fill you in on something else. Listen. Those words were written about a man that God described as a man after His own heart. Do you hear me? Those are not the words of David describing, I'm a man after God's own heart. Those are not the words of some commentator or some friend of his says, I think David is a man after God's own heart. Those are the words of an all-knowing God who knows the thoughts and intents of every person, and that all-knowing God looked into the heart of that man David, and He said, here's a man who is after my own heart. Now, just to inform you and to help you to get that equation, if David, a man after God's own heart, described by God that way, can mess up, scar his life, and turn his life in a totally different direction away from holiness towards sin because he coasts, do you think there might be a chance you might be in danger? Do you think there's a possibility that you could face the same danger or greater danger if you begin to coast? You do not want to have written in your life, chapter 11, then it happened. What? He just coasted. Well, let's show you about the life of coasting. Look what happens in verse 2. David's at home. He's supposed to be in where? In the battle. But David's at home. Look what happens, verse 2. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her. And when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. Let's talk about the life that coasts. First of all, you're going to find in your spirit, if you're coasting, whether you realize it or not, you're going to find, write it down, a restlessness in your spirit. There's going to be a restlessness in your spirit. It wasn't David's. In verse 2 it says, and David arose from his, where? From his bed. In other words, what should David have been doing? Doing what? Sleeping. He's sleeping. It's nighttime. He's sleeping. He's resting. But something's happening in his heart. Something's restless in his heart. To the point that whenever he should be sleeping, he's not sleeping. He gets up out of his bed and he goes out walking around, and he's walking on the roof of his house when he should have been sleeping. Why was he not sleeping? Because when you're out of God's will and when you're coasting in your life, there's going to be a restlessness about you. Now, that may affect your sleep, or it may affect your meditation time, or it may affect what you're trying to choose to do, or it may affect all the things, decisions you make of what I got to do to keep me from feeling restless. I don't know, but I can assure you one thing. When you begin to coast in your life instead of having the peace of God, you're going to have a restlessness in your spirit. And David, being there in Jerusalem, instead of resting like he thought he was going to rest, when he decided not to go to battle, which he's supposed to go to battle, instead of resting, he's restless. What happens next? Well, as he is restless, he begins to walk around. He rose out of his bed. He begins to walk on the roof of his house. As he's walking on the roof of his house, it just so happens that there's a woman next door who's taking a bath. And he looks over and he sees this woman. Now, I hope you're aware of spiritual warfare enough to know that the devil is real. Satan is real. Okay? I'm going to say it again. Satan is real. And he is busy. And one of the things he's busy doing, and he loves to do, hold on a second, write it down. He loves to find coasting, restless believers. He loves them. They're easy prey. He sees them. And then he knows how to engineer the situations whereby he might cause them to fall. So David gets up. He's restless. He's walking on the roof of his house. And isn't it amazing that at that particular time, in that evening, that here's this woman that has decided that she's going to go take the bath in that place where David is able to look over and see this beautiful woman who's bathing. I wonder who put all that together. I wonder who engineered all of those things so that that would happen. Satan. And if he finds you coasting, he's going to try to engineer the situations to bring you just to a place to where you see, where you lust, where you desire, where you choose the wrong thing. Let me show you a verse of Scripture. Hold your hand here for just a minute. Turn to 1 John. 1 John chapter 2. Now remember we're talking about David, who's a man after God's own heart. He's this righteous man. But in 1 John chapter 2, John writes about the three root problems of man. Do you know that there are three root sins? Where all sin is birthed out of three root problems. You're going to have one of these. In this it shows that David illustrates all three. Look what it says in verse number 16. For all that is in the world, you need to circle that, all that's in the world, all the things of the world are not the things of God. You remember that? Look back in verse 15. Do not love the world, for the things are the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. So he's saying the things of the world are the opposite things of God. Listen what it says, verse 16. For all that is in the world, listen, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from God, but is from the world. You hear those three root sins? You hear it? Listen. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the boastful, sinful pride of life are not from God. Those are the three root problems, the root sins. David in this is going to illustrate all three. Wait a minute. He's a man after God's own heart. But a man after God's own heart who's coasting, who's restless, who's out of God's will. The most dangerous place you will ever be is out of God's will. Being out of God's will. And here's this man out of God's will, coasting and restless. And he illustrates all three. The lust of the eye. He sees her bathing. He sees her bathing. His eye sees it. The lust of the flesh. He pursues her to have a relationship with her, physically, sexually. The lust of his flesh. Wait a minute now. And when he inquires about her, he finds out who she is. And he finds out, listen, he finds out that she's married. Not only is she is married to Uriah the Hittite, who is one of his mighty men. You hear me? One of his mighty men, one of his loyal servants. Hold on a second. One of those over there fighting where he's supposed to be. And not only is Uriah one of his mighty men who's fighting for him, he was a friend. He was a friend. But let me tell you what sin does. Tell you what happens with sin. Whenever it begins to happen, and you lust with your eyes, and you lust with your flesh, you know what David says? He has the sinful pride of life. You know what his pride says? I don't care whose wife she is. I don't care if he is my friend. I don't care if he is one of my faithful, mighty men. I don't care if he's out there fighting the battle. I want what I want, and I'm the king. And I can have whatever I want because I am the king. And he goes and sins and brings her and has relationship with her because of his pride. In those verses, you see all three of the root problems of sin, and a man who had been described as a man after God's own heart, who has the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, sinful pride of life, in 2 verses. Because then it happened that he thought he could coast. That he thought he could stay home. That he thought he had done enough. There is danger in coasting. Well, not with me, Brother Mack. I mean, I'm not a king. Not with me, Brother Mack. I mean, old Satan doesn't care about me. Oh, yes. If you're a coasting believer, you are easy prey, and you're on his list. And he will engineer the situations in your life, if you are restless walking around, to show you stuff to make you have the lust of the eye. He'll bring about things to make you have the lust of the flesh. And he'll put pride so in your heart, you think you can do whatever you want to do, and you'll sin. And you know what you think you can do? You think you can do it, and you won't get caught. One of the most pathetic verses in all the Bible is verse 4. Listen what it says. And David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. In other words, she took a bath, she got all cleaned up, everything is fine, everything's wonderful. I'm going back to my house, and you stay at your house. And we committed sin, and we did all kind of ungodly things, things that are displeasing to God, but nobody knows. Nobody knows. Have you ever noticed something about, I don't know if it happens in your life or if it happens in other people that you know. You ever notice how a lot of times believers get caught? You know what I'm talking about? They get caught. I mean, I've known people in my life who live for the world. They were sinful. They didn't care about things. They would go out and they'd have extramarital relationships or premarital relationships, and not one time did they ever get pregnant. But I have also seen young believers. I'll never forget a young girl who was just younger than us in the church where Lynn grew up. And that little girl was the sweetest thing in the world. She had committed herself to mission. She loved the Lord. And she went out on a date one time and made one mistake. And she got pregnant. Totally, radically changed her life from what she had planned to do. You ever notice how whenever you're a child of God and whenever God holds you to a different standard and God expects things of you, that you just have a way of getting caught? Look what happens in verse number 5. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I'm pregnant. One misstep, and she gets pregnant. Why? Because God was holding David to a higher level of accountability. David, who was this man after his own heart, who decided he could coast and he could do whatever he wanted to do and whenever he wanted to do it and live like he wanted to live. And listen to me, if he hadn't gotten caught, if he hadn't dealt with that, he would have continued that process all of his life thinking, I can do what I want to do, I can do what I want to do what I want to do, and I won't ever get caught. It won't ever cost me. And God cared too much for David, had too great a plan for David to be mediocre in his life and spend the rest of his life just coasting. And when that happens, I'm telling you, things fall apart. Sin does not just stay one sin, it multiplies. I don't have time to read the story. You probably know the story, but let me tell you how that happens. You know what takes place? First of all, he's lusted with his eye, lusted with his flesh, sinful pride of life. All that's sin. Had sexual relationship, now he's gotten a lady pregnant. And what's he going to do? He's got to protect his image. He's got to protect his sin. He's got to protect himself. So what does he do? He says, bring Uriah home. He brings Uriah home. That's a sin of deception. He's bringing him home with not the right reason. He's bringing him home to give us a report of what's happening. Oh, yes, and by the way, when you give me that report, I want you to go home to your wife tonight. I'd like for you to go spend time with your wife tonight. That'd be a good thing for you to have fellowship. Now, why did that happen? Because if he would have gone home, had relationships with his wife, it would never be known whose child this might be. But Uriah, instead of going home, he goes out and he sits by the gate and sleeps by the gate. And they tell David, he didn't go home. He brings him in and says, Uriah, why in the world didn't you go home? Oh, I couldn't possibly go home and sleep in the bed whenever all those soldiers out there and they're sleeping in tents and on the ground. I would never go home and sleep in my bed with my wife when I know those guys out there serving you are sleeping on the ground. Oh, no, that didn't work. So the next thing he does, he gets him drunk. He brings him in, gets him drunk. Boy, that sounds like a man after God's own heart, doesn't it? What a wretched sin. Gets him drunk out of his head, thinking if I can get him so drunk, he'll go home and not know what he did, and he'll have relationships with his wife. But he didn't go home. He goes out there and sleeps with the servants, and he doesn't go home. David is still guilty. David's still going to be found out. So what does he do? Listen to this. Listen to this. He sends Uriah back to the front line with a letter to his commander Joab and says, I want you to put Uriah on the front line. Remember, Uriah was a mighty man of God, one of the best soldiers Joab had, one who loved David and gave his life for David. Put Uriah right up on the front line where the fighting is most fierce, and then I want you to back off of him and let him be killed. You know what David did? He murdered Uriah. Why? To protect himself, to protect his image. He ruined his credibility with Joab, who knew something was not right for David to give such a command. And all of that is put together in that one chapter. But notice the last verse, verse 27. And when the time of mourning, whenever she had mourned, David took her and married her. David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife. Then she bore him a son. But notice what it says in verse 27. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. Don't you know David wished that commentary was not written about him? Don't you wish that he had a chance to say, I don't want that in there. I want editorial rights on this. What he had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. Hold on a second. All because he coasted. Just going to pull it down in neutral and let it go where it will. I'm just going to coast. Surely nobody's going to get hurt if I just coast. Surely God will understand if I just want to coast. There's a costly casualty whenever you decide to coast. And that's not just for David. That's for each of us. You can't afford to coast. Well, Brother Mack, when am I going to get to rest? When you go to glory. You want to go to glory? You get to rest in glory. Oh, I still think you're going to have work to do, but it's just going to be fun work. You're not ever going to get tired. Isn't that nice? There's not going to be nobody in heaven going to say, I'm so tired. Some of y'all not going to know what to say. Because most of us walk around, boy, I'm so tired. I just got out of bed and I'm so tired. It's the middle of the day and I'm tired. When you get to glory, you're not going to be tired. Amen? Learn a new vocabulary. That's going to be neat. And you'll get to rest when you go to glory, but not now. Not now. Now what we'll see is that David wants to hide his sin. He thinks it's all hidden, but God knows it. And God's going to confront him about that. And listen to me, God's going to confront you. Some of you have been coasting. Some of you got sin in your life. Some of you have been making wrong decisions. And you need to get that right. And the Holy Spirit of God will convict you of that. And He is faithful and just to forgive you of your sin just as He does David. And He'll restore you. You need to do that. If you're not coasting, don't start coasting. If you've been coasting, stop coasting. Get it back in gear and start moving. And if you, in your coasting, have sinned and made mistakes, confess it before God. Get that right before God. He will restore you and put it back in gear and begin to go so that you're not easy prey for the enemy.